This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
And where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to the 14th episode of the Naked Mormonism podcast. I'm Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Last episode, we compared the upbringing of Joseph Smith to that of Charles Darwin. I couldn't help but notice some of the similarities as well as the vast differences between these two young men as they were growing up to become the person that history would know them as. They grew up a mere 4 years apart from each other, but the environments they were each raised in differed from each other almost oppositely. Charles grew up in a stable household with a comfortable income to support his family. Both of his parents were educated and divorced themselves from typical fundamentalist Christian beliefs in lieu of a more fluid and progressive perspective. Charles and his brother Erasmus got to play with a chemistry set that was in their backyard while growing up. Charles and all the Darwins grew up with stable schooling, and most of them pursued higher education upon completion of basic schooling. His siblings went on to be doctors and lawyers, and Charles went on to publish all of the work that he did up until the year he died of old age in 1882. Joe, on the other hand, had a completely different lifestyle. Through really no fault of his own. He grew up in rags because his family couldn't afford to buy him and all his siblings new clothes of their own. Everything was handed down from his brothers. Nobody will know precisely how the Smiths survived as long as they did without any form of stable income. Now, Big Daddy Cheese, Joseph Smith Sr., was known to be a bit of a speculator, meaning he would find things to buy and sell or make things to sell to try and support his family of 13. Well, he was destructively unsuccessful in most of his deals, but somehow the family still persisted on. I will never understand how. Joe actually never attended a school faithfully for any extended period of time. There are a few instances where he may have been attending for 6 or so months at a time, but for the most part, formal education was completely out of the picture for the entire Smith family. The primary issue with this is Joe's personality. It didn't do well as an idle youth. His mind was hungry for stimulation, and it wasn't getting the materials and environment it needed to expand into a productive brain inside of a productive member of society. Joe had the ability to excel at most endeavors he encountered because he was so smart and resourceful, but this lack of proper stimulation led Joe to become an indolent drunkard of a young man that was quick to fabricate a story or circumstance to get something out of somebody. He told people about his amazing abilities to see amazing things in the ground, not just treasure buried by the Spanish settlers, but even massive gold smelters that were buried in the hill that the ancients of the continent supposedly used to smelt gold ore into treasure, which they apparently buried along with the smelter. I mean, that makes sense, right? This is supposedly where all of the hills in Manchester County, New York, and Harmony, Pennsylvania came from. Ancient forerunners burying their super special treasure for somebody to find thousands of years later. It's just amazing. It demonstrates a simple lack of understanding of history, geology, mineral probing, and everything science in general. But can we really blame Joe for any of it? Sure, he was responsible for his own actions, as we all are, but what percentage of batshittery that Joe did was actually a product of his environment? how many of his actions were motivated by personal apathy and pathological lying to try and simply get enough food to survive on. We can simply never know what kind of a person Joe would have been if he were offered a nurturing home life and a little bit of formal education. This kind of juxtaposition of Joe and Darwin seems to provide some kind of insight into the potential of humans needing to be nurtured, in a positive way, of course, for the optimal outcome, as opposed to Joe's upbringing where he was fed and thus perpetuated lies and misunderstandings of the world around him. This is a great analog for what we see today when we compare differing societies around the world. Quite simply, if any given society has a better education system than another, be it a city, a state, or a country, or even like entire regions, statistically speaking, the more educated society unfailingly has a better standard of living and more equality for its citizens. The model scales from the individual on one end of the spectrum to entire groups of people on the other, and it's proved itself to be an accurate model throughout antiquity. I really wonder how some people today can oppose education of any sort based solely off this model alone. How can less education possibly be a good thing? Well, personal opinions aside, let's get to the content in today's episode. Last episode's history portion ended with a newspaper article about some preacher from Ohio named Henry Rigdon. This was actually alluding to Sidney Rigdon, and he is the focus of this episode. There's a lot of information to cover when it comes to Sidney, so I'll just jump right in with his early life. Sidney Rigdon was born in St. Clair Township, Pennsylvania, February 19, 1793. The area today is known as Library, Pennsylvania, and it's about 30 miles east of the Ohio border and about 10 miles south of Pittsburgh, a day's journey in that time. He had almost 13 years on Joseph. Just a little aside, it's not that important. He was the youngest of 4 children of William and Nancy Rigdon. His father was a farmer and a native of Hartford County, Maryland. Rigdon's father, William Rigdon, died in 1810 while Sidney was 17. According to an 1875 account attributed to Rigdon's elder brother and published by Robert Patterson Jr. in 1882, Rigdon had a little accident that may have something to do with his personality. It is worth noting that this was published possibly 60 to 80 years after this situation happened, which is quoting a first-hand witness that was recounted by a nonagenarian 7 years before its printing. It isn't the strongest piece of evidence, but it was recounted by a first-hand account, and it's something that provides explanatory power for what we can consider mental conditions, looking back on the character of Sidney. So here it is, quote, Sidney Rigdon, when quite a boy, living with his father some 15 miles south of Pittsburgh on a farm, was thrown from his horse, his foot entangled in a stirrup, and dragged some distance before relieved. In this accident, he received such a contusion of the brain as ever after seriously to affect his character and in some respects his conduct. In fact, his brother always considered Sidney a little deranged in his mind by that accident. His mental powers did not seem to be impaired, but the equilibrium of his intellectual exertions seemed thereby to have been sadly affected. He still manifested great mental activity and power, but he was to an equal degree inclined to run into wild and visionary views on almost every question. Hence, he was a fit subject for any new movement in the religious world. End quote. Like I said, the evidence for this event actually occurring is a little bit shaky, but it does serve to explain some behaviors of Rigdon and tells us that it made him, quote, a fit subject for any new movement in the religious world, end quote. He was known to snap in and out of lucid trances, wherein he would reveal the will of the Lord, or prophesy something, or would be told where hidden treasure was. But he wasn't just a zealot with brain damage. He was also one of the smartest people in the group. In fact, Rigdon was the most intelligent and educated out of the group once he teamed up with Joe and friends, whether measured by structured schooling or simply by number of books he read. He was just the smartest. So moving on, this is a quote that's much more substantiated than the last one was. Now, while the last quote was just one snippet of insight into the early life of Rigdon, this entire episode is based around a lecture that was written by John M. Rigdon, who is Sidney Rigdon's son. I'll qualify the authenticity of the quote in a little while, but first we need to get properly acquainted with Rigdon growing up. So this is the lecture by John M. Rigdon on early history of the Mormon Church. Quote, "Perhaps it might be well enough for me to tell you what kind of a man Sidney Rigdon was, and then you will see why the world claimed he was the author of the Book of Mormon." That's interesting, isn't it? Sidney Rigdon was born in the year of 1793 in Washington County, Pennsylvania. His father, William Rigdon, was a farmer living on a farm 10 miles from Pittsburgh, being then a city of about 10,000 inhabitants. His father, William Rigdon, married a wife by the name of Nancy Gallagher. They had 4 children. Sidney Rigdon was the youngest. He had 2 brothers and 1 sister. His oldest brother, Carvel Rigdon, married and moved on a farm near to the old homestead. His second brother, Loma Rigdon, was a sickly boy and unable to work on the farm. His sister, Lacey Rigdon, married one Peter Boyer, who owned a farm near the old homestead, and moved with her husband, Peter Boyer, to this farm, leaving Loma Rigdon and Sidney Rigdon on the old homestead with their father and mother. It was the rule in the country that when a boy was too feeble to work in a farm, they would send him to school and give him an education. Loma Rigdon was too sickly and feeble to labor on a farm, and his parents decided to send him to school and give him an education. Sidney Rigdon wanted to go to school and pleaded with his father and mother to let him go with his brother to school, but they would not consent to let him go, saying to him he was able to work on the farm and he could not go. At last, finding they would not let him go to school, he said to them in anger he would have as good an education as his brother got, and they could not prevent it. So his brother Loma was sent to school. He went to Lexington, Kentucky, studied medicine, and became a physician. He never returned to the old homestead to live, but went to Hamilton in the state of Ohio and there practiced medicine for over 40 years, leaving Sidney Rigdon and his father and mother on the farm to live. End quote. Isn't it fascinating how we can see the failings and issues that this 19th century agrarian model for a society creates? William and Nancy Rigdon obviously had some smart children, and they were motivated to learn and make something of themselves. But Sidney was forced to work on the farm, which he hated doing, instead of going to school to learn an educated profession. He was so angry that he was denied access to this cushier lifestyle that he still fit his own education into his young life, even though he was farming with his father full time. Though quote continues in support of my claim that this is not the optimal model for a society. Quote, Sidney Rigdon, after his brother Loma Rigdon had gone to Lexington, Kentucky, he borrowed all the histories he could get and began to read them. His parents would not let him have a candle to read by night. He therefore gathered hickory bark. There was plenty of it around the old farm, and he used to get it and at night throw it into the old fireplace, and lay with his face bent towards the fire and read history till nearly morning, unless his parents got up and drove him to bed before that time. In this way, he became a great historian, the best I ever saw. He seemed to have the history of the world on his tongue's end, and he got to be a great biblical scholar as well. He was as familiar with the Bible as a child was with his spelling book. He was never known to play with the boys. Reading books was the greatest pleasure he could get. He studied English grammar alone and became a very fine grammarian. He was very precise in his language. At length, his father, William Rigdon, died, leaving Sidney Rigdon and his mother alone on the farm. At length, they got tired of living alone on the farm. It was lonesome, and they sold the farm, and his mother went to live with her daughter, Mrs. Peter Boyer, and Sidney Rigdon went to study theology under a Baptist minister by the name of Peters, who belonged to what was called the Straight Baptist, end quote. And thus, we see the beginning of Rigdon's journey of the preaching circuit throughout Ohio and Pennsylvania. It begins in Pennsylvania in 1818 under this minister Peters. After a few months of apprenticeship, Rigdon moved in with Reverend Andrew Clark in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, and earned his ministering license in March 1819. After this, Rigdon was on the fast track to become the renowned preacher his destiny would call him to be. John Rigdon's lecture continues, quote, "I do not know what the straight Baptist means, unless it is those Baptists who believe in infant damnation, and that, it would seem to me, to be straight enough for most anyone." After getting his license to preach, he went to Pittsburgh and preached a short time there, and then went to the town of Warren, Ohio, and remained there about 2 years. End quote. This is referring to when Rigdon moved in with a guy named Adamson Bentley, right before he married Bentley's sister, Phoebe Brooke, and soon after met Alexander Campbell. This entire transition phase of 4 years, from 1818 living with his mom on a farm to 1822 being a preacher with his own church, was a very formative time for Rigdon. He was establishing a name for himself and rubbing elbows with all the biggest names and congregations in the area. There is no doubt, Rigdon was a charismatic motherfucker and people liked to hear him talk. Take the next paragraph in John's lecture, for example, quote, "He did not have any particular charge of a church, but wherever a vacancy occurred in the country, he always filled, and that way got a reputation of being a very eloquent preacher. Nature made him an orator, and his great knowledge of history and the Bible gave him the knowledge so he was able to talk on almost any subject. He was of natural religious turn of mind, and he delighted in preaching the gospel." End quote. Here we have Rigdon wandering around Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, preaching at any church that will allow him to have the podium for any given period of time. He knew a lot about a lot of things, one of which was the Bible, and everybody loved how he was able to convey his message about Jesus and tie it in with the history that he knew, and then couple it with how it applies to situations today. This level of charisma and intellect is only seen in a very small percentage of the population, but I think Joe might have had a similar mindset and intellect to Rigdon. They both seem similar in quite a few ways. Hungry for knowledge, capable of fashioning together stories or prophecy into one coherent thought, well enough to persuade most that were willing to listen, along with many other attributes that can posthumously be applied to both men interchangeably. I think this might have a little to do with how Joe and Sidney were able to get along so well and accomplish so much together. Not only were they similar enough to get along with each other, but their strengths and weaknesses complemented each other. Joe never could have booted up the church if he didn't have help from Rigdon. It would have merely shriveled up and died without him. I'll get into those details later, but for now, Rigdon is the focus. Out of all of these moves, fill-ins, and meet and greets with any church that was willing to have him, the next move that Rigdon makes is the largest and most formative of all in his lifetime leading up to this. Adamson, Bentley, and Rigdon meet up with a couple guys named Walter Scott and Alexander Campbell. They were two of the 4 founders of the Campbellite Christianity, and they were looking for some charismatic young men to be their newest preachers. Here enters Parley P. Pratt, Orson Hyde, Lyman White, Edward Partridge, and quite a few others. Those were a lot of new names that probably only ring a bell with true-believing Mormons and ex-Mormons today, but they're all essential to the early expansion of the Mormon Church, so it's worth mentioning them for now. So Bentley and Rigdon were learning all about this new form of Christianity that believed in baptism by immersion for the remission of sins only after the age of reason is attained, meaning no infant baptism or damnation. This was considered a blasphemy by other Catholic or Protestant groups that heard of this new doctrine, and it especially upset the Baptists, to the point that there were schisms of various Baptist sects that sprang up from arguments about these specific doctrines. One other thing to mention about Campbellism, they believed that the true church needed to be, quote-unquote, restored to the earth through a prophet before the millennium was nigh, also known as a restorationist or a millennialist belief. They considered Alexander Campbell to be their prophet, and Mormonism believed Joseph Smith to be their prophet. Those were just some interesting similarities in doctrine between Mormonism and Campbellism to simply point out for now, but I'll revisit them later when they become a little bit more relevant. Up to this point, I've just been taking little snippets from this lecture that was written by John Rigdon, Sidney's son, who was actually born in 1830, just a little side note. Well, I'm going to read the beginning of it to tie everything together this far. Keep in mind, we're reading a biased report from Rigdon's only living son at the time, so no other eyewitnesses that were in a similar position to John Rigdon were left alive to contradict what he wrote. That being said, he is a first-hand witness, and it does tell us a lot about Sidney's separation from the LDS Church. Quote, I am the only living son of Sidney Rigdon, who died in the town of Friendship, New York, the summer of 1876, who was, at the time of his death, about 83 years old. There were 12 children in my father's family. They're all dead except for myself. Sidney Rigdon joined the Mormon Church in the year of 1830 at Kirtland, Ohio, and in the year 1833 was ordained Joseph Smith's first counselor, which position he retained up to the time of Joseph Smith's death at Carthage, Illinois, who was killed by a mob on the 27th day of June, 1844. I never knew a time when I did not know Joseph Smith. I knew him from my earliest recollections up to the time of his assassination at Carthage in the state of Illinois. I was familiar with him as I was with my own father. I used to see him almost every day of my life. My father and his family almost always lived very close to him. I used to see him every day and sometimes much oftener." End quote. So John was actually in the first generation of people to be born into the doctrine of Joseph Smith's church, and he was a faithful member up to his death, although it's not really clear to me which faction of the church he was loyal to. Joseph Smith or not, John was loyal to his father, Sidney Rigdon, and the entire legacy of the Rigdon family. Therefore, I don't believe he would ever contradict any of Sidney's claims. I doubt he even knew any better than what Sidney would have taught him as a child. So this is where things start to become really interesting. Quote, "When my father and mother joined the Mormon church at Kirtland, Ohio, he, my father, was living at a little town called Mentor in the state of Ohio, about 5 miles from Kirtland. He was at the time he joined the Mormon church preaching, which was then Campbellitism, now called Christian, and soon after he joined the Mormon church, he was charged with having written the Book of Mormon." End quote. This was tantamount to the early expansion of the LDS Church, but right now it's just setting the stage. According to church history, Rigdon wouldn't meet Joe for another 8 years after he started preaching Campbellism, but we'll get into those claims later. What we need to focus on is the apologetic that John is offering here, arguing that his father never wrote the Book of Mormon and vehemently denied any association with Joe while he was writing the Book of Mormon. Quote, "He always denied the same to friend and foe alike, but they would not believe him. They would claim that he stole one Solomon Spaulding's manuscript, and from that concocted out of the same manuscript the Book of Mormon." End quote. I skipped over the part in Rigdon's timeline that included all the connections with Solomon Spaulding because I want to introduce it all in kind of a succinct little package instead of peppering it throughout the history. But it is worth shining the spotlight on when people came up with the theory and started accusing Sidney and Joe of forgery. Quote, "He used to tell them he never saw Spaulding's manuscript in his life, but the people of the world would not believe him and continued to assert that he did write the Book of Mormon and gave it to Joseph Smith to introduce to the world. The religions of the world were determined to prove, if they could, that the Book of Mormon was not obtained as Joseph Smith claimed, that an angel from heaven appeared to him and told him where to go and find which was buried in the hill near Palmyra, New York. The fact that Joseph Smith had the book, all that knew him said he did not know enough to have it written, and somebody else must be found who they thought could have written it. For to admit that an angel appeared to Joseph Smith and told him where to go and find it was a reflection on their religion, and their religion must be maintained at all hazards. Therefore, they selected Sidney Rigdon as the man." End quote. John just made a fast and loose claim there. He said that other religious people around the Mormons were determined to prove Joe wrong at all costs. That's what it meant when it says, quote, "their religion must be maintained at all hazards," end quote. It's due to the fact that John felt persecuted by other religious people that would assert the Spalding-Sidney connection, and John wouldn't believe them no matter what facts they laid in front of him. He thought that everybody else was trying to prove the Book of Mormon inaccurate because they were afraid of the consequences of the Mormon Church being the one true church. John doesn't say this explicitly, but it isn't hard to read between such defined lines. Quote, "At length he got married. He married a daughter of Jeremiah Brooks," that was Phoebe, "who was also a great Baptist. And soon after his marriage, he and his wife started on their wedding tour to go to Pittsburgh to visit his brother, his mother, and sister, who resided 10 miles from Pittsburgh." End quote. Sidney and Phoebe were making the rounds to Sidney's hometown so he could show off his new wife to his mother and two siblings and, all of his friends back home. This worked swimmingly, and it was the start of something new and exciting. Just to let you know, Rigdon and Bentley met Alexander Campbell in 1822, and in 1823, Rigdon picked up his own church to start preaching as head pastor under the direction of Alexander Campbell. This is detailed in the next segment of John's lecture, but he leaves out the part about this preaching to be Campbellistic in nature. Quote, "They went on horseback. That is the way they rode in those days. What else would they do? Drive in a fucking car? Of course they rode on horseback. They reached Pittsburgh on Saturday night and stayed there overnight. One of the members of the Baptist church who had heard my father preach came to see him and wanted to know if he would not come to the Baptist church and preach to them Sunday morning. He said they had one of the largest churches in the city of Pittsburgh, but the church had become divided, and they had no minister and had no preaching in the church, and he would be much pleased if he would come and preach to them Sunday morning. He told the brother he would. The brother gave notice that night that there would be preaching in the church. The next morning, quite a little congregation gathered at the church to hear him preach. After his discourse, he told the congregation that he was going out into the country about 10 miles from the city to visit his brother and mother and sister, and should remain out there about 4 weeks. And if they wished him to come into the city and preach to them every Sunday morning during the time he remained out in the country, he would do so, as he could ride into the city every Sunday morning and preach to them and go back in the afternoon. This offer they gladly accepted, and my father preached in the church for 4 Sundays in succession. When he got ready to go home, he and his wife came to Pittsburgh and stayed overnight, and quite a number of members of the church called to see them and wanted to know if he would not, when he got home, come back and take charge of the church and be their pastor. They said to them they had the largest congregation in Pittsburgh. When they were united, and they thought from what they had heard of his preaching, he could unite them. They would be much pleased to have him come back and be their minister. He said to them that he would take the matter under advisement, and when he got home, he would consider the matter and let them know. End quote. So Rigdon here was offered a chance of a lifetime. He was a newly licensed preacher and had a way with words that people loved, and his world was just starting to turn into favor of that eloquent speech. Let me continue here. Quote, "When he got home, he told his father-in-law of the offer at the church at Pittsburgh, and he, being a great Baptist, urged him by all means to accept it, as it was not very often a young minister received such an offer. It might be the making of him to give him a great reputation. He therefore informed the members of the church at Pittsburgh that he accepted their offer and would soon come to Pittsburgh and become their pastor. Soon after informing them of his acceptance, he returned to Pittsburgh with his wife and became pastor of the Baptist church. It was not long after he took charge of the church until he united the church that he had the largest congregation in the city, and in less than 1 year, he had the reputation of being one of the most eloquent preachers in the city." End quote. Rigdon was becoming a bit of a badass around Pittsburgh. A lot of people there knew him from his young days when he grew up near Pittsburgh, as it was the largest town closest to his house while growing up, and therefore, of course, a social hub of the area. Rigdon had gone off to preacher college for a year or two, and had been an apprentice, basically, to learn the preaching circuit. He returned back home with a lovely new wife, and the people thought that he was going to be the next big pastor in Pittsburgh. Well, they were right. He drew a massive following, the biggest in Pittsburgh, in fact, and Pittsburgh was the biggest city in Pennsylvania at the time, and one of the biggest city populations in the early states in 1823. Now, Rigdon here wasn't running just another little church in one of his circuit tours. He was running a big-time gig for almost 2 years. A lot of people traveled from far and wide, from New York, Vermont, from a lot of the surrounding states, to see this new exciting spokesman for the Lord. Tons of people converted to his form of Baptist, even though it was a bastardized Campbellite version of Baptism, I guess it's called, which ended up actually fucking him over in the late 1823. But we aren't there yet, so we'll let John continue here. Quote, "Everything went smoothly along. Fame and fortune seemed to be within his grasp. At length, an old Scotch divine came to Pittsburgh and wanted to know of my father if he preached and taught the Baptist confession of faith. Infant damnation. Uh-oh, that's the sticking point. This was a big problem for Rigdon. If he was going to be an ordained preacher of the Baptist faith, he had to play by their rules and teach the exact tenets of the Baptist confession of faith. Any person that's found teaching something that differs from this confession of faith would have corrective actions taken against them. Now, in extreme cases where the perpetrating preacher was teaching something that was directly contradictory to the tenets of the Baptist Church at large, which is what Rigdon was doing by refusing to preach infant damnation, they would go to extreme lengths to take care of the problem. In Sidney's case, they blackballed him from ever being a Baptist preacher and motivated him to resign, quote-unquote motivated, from his position of authority. I kind of wonder how the Scotch divine did that.
I want you to rest well, and a month from now, this Hollywood big shot's gonna give you what you want.
Too late. They start shooting in a week.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
I mean, I'm just posing it as a possibility. Let me continue here with John's lecture. Quote, "He told me he did not teach infant damnation as he did not believe it and would not teach it. The Scotch divine replied to him that he would have to teach it as it was part of the Baptist confession of faith. My father replied to him that he did not care if it was a part of the Baptist confession of faith. It was to him too horrible a doctrine for him to teach, and he would have nothing to do with it. His refusal to teach the Baptist confession of faith occasioned quite a stir among the congregation. The older members of the church thought he ought to teach it as it was a part of their confession of faith, while the younger members thought he acted wisely in refusing to teach the doctrine. My father, seeing there was to be a division in the church, tendered his resignation and the church got another minister." End quote. That was Rigdon's fucking dream, to run a church as a minister and teach what he knew to be the truth about Jesus. But just like you can't sell Jimmy John's at a Subway, you can't use an existing church's infrastructure and following to preach your own version of Jesus. Now, this may be the most efficient way of getting a following in the fastest way possible, as we've seen throughout all the rebrandings of Christianity throughout history, but it won't go unnoticed by the higher-ups in the church that you're drawing your following from. Rigdon didn't expect what he taught to be worthy of forced exodus from his authority, and was probably caught off guard. That would explain why he didn't struggle for the leadership position or try to rally his followers to immediately follow him instead of continuing to follow the antiquated church. Well, to be fair, he just didn't rally them to leave the church quite yet. But let's hear what happens next according to the same lecture we've been reading the majority of this time. John Rigdon continues, quote, "After resigning the pastorship of the Baptist church, he remained in Pittsburgh about 2 years. After that, in a tan yard with his brother-in-law, Richard Brooks, who was a tanner and courier by trade, who started a tannery in Pittsburgh. My father contributed some money in the business. End quote. So this was Rigdon's journeyman tannership, or his second round, basically. He completed his apprenticeship around 1816, but that's not really relevant right now. So, quote, at the end of 2 years, they sold the tanner. Soon after that, Sidney Rigdon became acquainted with Alexander Campbell, who was a very learned man, but not much of an orator. He and Campbell got their heads together and started what was then called Campbellite Church, now called Christian. Sidney Rigdon baptized Campbell, and Campbell baptized him, and the church was started. End quote. Does that sound familiar? Maybe with Joe and Cowdung there? Maybe. Anyway, the way that this is worded is kind of confusing, to be honest, and it can obfuscate what historians believe to really have happened. The Campbellite Church was up and coming already when Sidney officially got together with Alexander Campbell. Rigdon didn't team up with Alexander Campbell to start the Campbellite religion. They teamed up to start a Campbellite church. There's a big distinction between the two phrases. So, you know when a kid tells a story about his dad, some of the facts tend to be a little inflated, even if there's an underlying truth that it reveals? Well, I think that might be what John Rigdon has been doing for some time in this lecture, but especially right here. He basically claimed that Rigdon was a responsible party for starting the Campbellite Church, and that's just not quite factually accurate. It's close to what happened, but not quite. If we change the wording like I described from the Alexander religion to the Campbellite religion instead of a Campbellite church, we can accept this statement as accurate. So I'm just going to continue with it. Quote, there was not much of their confession of faith. It was to believe in the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, be baptized for the remission of your sins, and take the Bible for your guide, was all there was of it. Its simplicity recommended itself to the general public, and Sidney Rigdon went to Mentor, Ohio, and commenced to preach the doctrine. He soon had quite a large congregation. They built him a church, and he again seemed to be on the high road to fame and fortune. End quote. There it is. The people loved him so much and loved his teachings that they built him a church in Mentor, Ohio, which is less than 4 miles from Kirtland, Ohio. Now, this should set off some listeners' radar. Kirtland was one of the early sites for the Mormon Church and is full of brain-melting history and mountains of deception. But that doesn't come up for a while in the history, so we'll have to put it off for now. Let's finish talking about Rigdon and then move on to introducing the Spalding theory. Quote, one day the congregation asked him what he was going to charge them per year for his preaching. He said, nothing. He said the apostles asked nothing for their preaching, and he was not going to charge anything. They said to him in reply that he had been giving them the gospel, and now they were going to give him something. They bought him a little farm, coming right up to the edge of the village, and had built him a house. End quote. I don't think that crowd quite understood what Rigdon just did there. They offered him compensation for preaching, and like a quote-unquote modest preacher would do, he said, I don't need anything. The Lord will provide, just like he did for his apostles. And of course, the people considered him to be an even a holier man for this arrogantly narcissistic action with a paper-thin facade, and decided to give him a land and a house. You know, this kind of seems to model a lot of ministries today, doesn't it? Oh, and he was able to claim lay clergy status, meaning he wasn't paid for his ministry, which is something else that seems almost sacred to so many religions today, especially the Mormon Church. This next part is up to conjecture. This is the problem with citing a pro-Mormon source with an agenda. They may say things that obfuscate the facts or just outright lie about some things. Whether by their own volition or because they have wrong information, we have to take some statements with a Titanic sinking grain of salt. I'm afraid that's what happens next, and it's perfectly in line with Mormon church teachings today, even though we have a considerable amount of conflicting data that serves to undermine the agenda that the early church was pushing and continues to push today. But I'll cover that in a minute. John Rigdon continues, quote, "It, meaning the house they built, was almost ready for him to move into, when along came Parley Pratt, Oliver Cowdery, and one Ziba Patterson with the Book of Mormon. It was a bound volume, and it was the first time Sidney Rigdon ever saw it or ever heard of the man called Joseph Smith." End quote. I'm afraid that's the statement I have a problem with. I'll talk about the conflicting evidence after I finish this paragraph, but it's not the quality of the conflicting evidence. It's a matter of what it implies that bothers me so much. That's what I hope to convey when we really dive into the Solomon Spaulding theory. Let's just finish with this John Rigdon lecture. Quote, "Parley Pratt presented the book to my father, Sidney Rigdon, in the presence of my mother and my oldest sister, who was a young girl of 10 years of age. Parley Pratt used to be a Baptist minister. Brother Rigdon, here is a book which is a revelation from God." End quote. All right, the deconstruction starts now. Parley Pratt was not just acquainted with Sidney Rigdon, he was one of his followers in the Campbellite movement. Rigdon and Parley Pratt probably knew each other quite well, but Pratt was also good friends with Oliver Cowdery, who was Cowdung all over, and he was one of the earliest converts to Mormonism, being baptized around September 5th, 1830, by Cowdung. Parley Pratt was one of the earliest and most zealous missionaries for the church, once Joe cut the ribbon, of course, and probably knew Joe well before April of 1830. We know that Cowdung and Joe knew each other and spent time with each other a number of times growing up, being third cousins and, having dads that were in the same Zionist divining cult together. The connections throughout these key individuals are just starting to be brought to the surface. There are plenty of deeper connections to get into, but for now, we need to talk about what other people recorded about Rigdon knowing Joe that comes into conflict with the claims made by John Rigdon's lecture here. I took this from an article on MormonThink.com, which cites an article on MormonStudies.com. I'll leave a link for the original article and for the Mormon Think article in the show notes, and I really recommend reading it to try and get a better grasp on what the next episode is going to be about. So this is quoting from the Mormon Think article. Quote, "If the Spaulding-Rigdon theory is correct, Rigdon would have visited Smith several times prior to 1830. He also would have had motivation to minimize his connection to Smith, and he would therefore have taken care to conceal himself. Thus, sightings of Rigdon at the Smith residence prior to that date, while supportive of the Spaulding-Rigdon theory, are not essential to the overall theory." End quote. But it's worth mentioning because it does lend some credence to the Spaulding theory, which is nice to have because the theory in and of itself is a little cumbersome yet shaky, and it's always up for conjecture. Quote, "Two individuals provided statements indicating that they had seen Sidney Rigdon in New York prior to 1830. One, Abel D. Chase, taken from a statement of May 2nd, 1972. Second, Lorenzo Saunders, affidavit with William H. Kelly of September 20th, 1884, and an interview by E.L. Kelly on November 12th, 1884, and a letter to Thomas Gregg, January 28th, 1885. And then another statement to Arthur Deming, July 21st, 1887. John H. Gilbert repeatedly confirmed that Lorenzo Saunders had reported seeing Rigdon prior to 1830, and that was in a letter to James T. Cobb of October 14th, 1879, and an 1881 interview by William H. and Edmund L. Kelly. So that was a whole lot of dates and a whole lot of names of craziness, but we're going to examine the two primary quotes that it talks about here, and those are by Abel Chase and Lorenzo Saunders. So the first one was written by Abel D. Chase and was written and signed on May 2nd, 1879. Hopefully you recognize the last name. Quote, "I, Abel D. Chase, now living in Palmyra, New York, make the following statement regarding my early acquaintance with Joseph Smith and the incidents about the production of the so-called Mormon Bible. I was well acquainted with the Smith family, frequently visiting the Smith boys, and they me. I was a youth at the time, from 12 to 13 years old, having been born January 19, 1814, at Palmyra, New York, a native. During some of my visits at the Smiths, I saw a stranger there who they said was a Mr. Rigdon. He was at Smith's several times, and it was in the year 1827 when I saw him there, as near as I can recollect. Some time after that, tales were circulated that young Joe had found or dug from the earth a book of plates, which the Smiths called the Golden Bible. I don't think Smith had any such plates. He was mysterious in his actions. The peepstone, in which he was accustomed to look, he got off my elder brother Willard while at work for us digging a well. It was a singular-looking stone, and young Joe pretended he could discover hidden things in it. My brother, Willard Chase, died at Palmyra, New York, March 10, 1871. His affidavit, published in Howe's History of Mormonism, is genuine. Peter Ingersoll, whose affidavit was published in the same book, is also dead. He moved west years ago and died about 2 years ago. Ingersoll had the reputation of being a man of his word, and I have no doubt his sworn statement regarding the Smiths and the Mormon Bible is genuine. I was also well acquainted with Thomas P. Baldwin, a lawyer and a notary public, and Frederick Smith, a lawyer and magistrate, before whom Chase's and Ingersoll's depositions were made, and who were residents of this village at the time and for several years after. End quote. So that was just Abel Chase basically claiming that all of the statements about the Mormons made by his brother Willard Chase and Peter Ingersoll are completely true, and he knows both of those guys, and he also knows the lawyer and notary publics that signed off on the letters for Eber D. Howe's book, Mormonism Unveiled, that therefore authenticated the statements that each of the guys made. So that was the first of the two that were cited. Now here's the second. Well, sort of. There's a little bit to talk about when it comes to this testimony, which will take us to the end of today's episode. So these statements, yes, multiple, were made by Lorenzo Saunders. There were 4 of them made publicly about the topic, and they tend to vary in detail and credibility, and the quotes almost raise more questions than they actually serve to answer, and the Mormon apologists love this fact. This is statement 1, and it is quoted from J.H. Gilbert. Quote, "Last evening, I had about 15 minutes conversation with Mr. Lorenzo Saunders of Reading, Michigan. He has been gone about 30 years from the Palmyra area. He was born south of our village in 1811 and was a near neighbor of the Smith family, knew them all well, was in the habit of visiting the Smith boys. Says he knows that Rigdon was hanging around Smith's for 18 months prior to the publishing of the Mormon Bible." End quote. This was the first statement published in 1879. That was 52 years after the incident supposedly occurred in 1827. That is the first and biggest problem with this statement, and there's simply no getting around that fact. A lot of things that we talk about when it comes to history were written a considerable amount of time after they reportedly happened. That is a historical blind spot that really can't be seen through, until we have retrospective time glasses to see in the past. I hear Google's working on it, but doesn't have anything promising yet. But the problem with evidence like this, especially when it's a witness testimony, which it oftentimes will be, is how unreliable it can be. When I said that the Spalding-Rigdon theory is on shaky ground, this is one of the main reasons why. Now, let's hear Saunders' second statement in an 1884 interview. The difference between this and the first statement is that this one is actually in Saunders' own words from his own mouth. The first statement we heard was in a letter written by J.H. Gilbert that was just quoting a conversation that he had had with Saunders. However, the next statement is actually made by Saunders himself and is actually an interview for the press. Now, this one may be almost 5 years after the first account from J.H. Gilbert, but it hits higher on the credibility scale because it was directly from a first-hand witness instead of paraphrased from somebody that had a conversation with the primary witness. So let's read statement 2, and this is taken from William Kelly's interview with Saunders. Quote, "The following interview was had with Lorenzo Saunders by William Kelly, an RLDS bishop, at Mr. L. Saunders' house, September 17, 1884, at the above-named place, which was read and signed by Mr. Saunders as being correct. Question, how old are you, Mr. Saunders? Answer, I was born in Palmyra, Wayne County, New York, June 7th, 1811. It's in the question-answer format. I'm just going to cut out the question and answer. So, question, did you ever hear Sidney Rigdon in the neighborhood where you lived previous to the 1830? In March 1827, about the middle of the month, I went over to Joe Smith's to eat sugar, and as I went over, I saw 5 or 6 men standing and talking. One was well dressed. They were about 20 rods from Smith's house. Do you know their names? Yes, it was Peter Ingersoll, Samuel Lawrence, George Proper, the old man Rockwell, father of Porter Rockwell, and the well-dressed man. They stood 10 rods from the road. When I got to the house, Harrison told me it was Sidney Rigdon, i.e. the well-dressed man. Did you see him after that, previous to the year 1830? Yes, I saw him in the fall, 1827, just before Joseph went to Pennsylvania. Peter Ingersoll and I met him in the road between Palmyra and Ingersoll's. I never saw him any more until he came to Palmyra to preach the Mormon Bible. Are you acquainted with a Mr. Gilbert of Palmyra? Yes. 4 years ago, I went to Palmyra to see my brothers, and I met Gilbert, so this was John H. Gilbert. He wanted to know if I remembered seeing Sidney Rigdon in that neighborhood previous to 1830, when he come preaching the Mormon Bible. He said Abel Chase testified that he thought he saw Rigdon before that time, but was not certain. Says I to Gilbert, Sidney Rigdon was about Smith's before 1830 in my opinion. Gilbert then asked me if I would make affidavit that I saw Rigdon at Smith's before that time, 1830. I told him I would think the matter over. After I got home a while, I received a letter from Cobb of Salt Lake. Gilbert wrote to Cobb and gave him my address. I wrote to Cobb the next spring. Gilbert wrote to me, I think in November, after I returned home asking why I did not answer Cobb's letter. While I was writing an answer to Cobb's first letter, my house caught fire and burnt. Burnt up everything I had and there was no insurance. Lost $1,000. I was some thinking the matter over before writing to Cobb, as requested by Gilbert, and during that time my house was burnt. It had been a long time since those transactions and it was difficult to fix dates, but I have it now so that I can tell it right off. How did you fix the date that you saw Sidney Rigdon at Smith's previous to 1830? When I was talking with Gilbert and told him I would think the matter over and see if I could make affidavit, and I fixed the time in my mind by remembering that I had gone over there to eat sugar. Was Peter Ingersoll and Samuel Lawrence acquainted with Sidney Rigdon? Yes, they were both acquainted with him in 1827. Sam Lawrence took Joe over into Pennsylvania and gave him a better education. I saw Rigdon in 1830 preach the Bible in one hand and the Book of Mormon in the other, and he said the Bible is now fulfilled and done away, and the Book of Mormon was to take its place. What kind of woman was Joseph's wife? Joseph's wife was a pretty woman, just as pretty a woman as I ever saw. When she come to the Smiths, she was disappointed, and used to come down to our house and sit down and cry. She said she was deceived and got into a hard place. When I was down to see my brother 4 years ago in a conversation with Gilbert when I first got there, it was then he said that he did not know that Sidney Rigdon was ever here previous to 1830. He believed he was, but they had no evidence. He said they had been studying on it for 35 or 40 years, but they could not get the evidence. Said if they could only make that point, the fraud would come out. He said he could come the nearest proving it by able chase, but he was not certain. When I got ready to come home, was there 3 weeks, Gilbert said he wanted to see me before I left. He was working on the canal, meaning the Erie Canal. He came to me as I was about to start home, and it was then that I told him that I had thought the matter over and made up my mind that I could swear that I saw Rigdon in the neighborhood in the spring of 1827. That is what he wanted I should write Cobb. This conversation was in Palmyra in front of John Saunders' store. End quote. Now, there's a little more to go on with that version, but before I get into addressing the claims themselves, I'll finish reading the other two statements, as they're quite similar to the second statement, but they vary on just a couple of small details. They're a lot shorter. Statement number 3, quote from a statement made to G. Gregg. Dear Sir, I received your note ready in hand, and will try to answer the best I can, and give all the information I can as respecting to Mormonism and the first origin. Now quoting Saunders, quote, I saw Sidney Rigdon in the spring of 1827, about the middle of March. I went to Smith's to eat maple sugar, and I saw 5 or 6 men standing in a group, and there was one among them better dressed than the rest. And I asked Harrison Smith who he was, and he said his name was Sidney Rigdon, a friend of Joseph's from Pennsylvania. I saw him in the fall of 1827 on the road between where I lived and Palmyra with Joseph. I was with a man by the name of Ingersoll. They talked together, and when he went on, I asked Ingersoll who he was, and he said it was Rigdon. Then in the summer of 1828, I saw him at Samuel Lawrence's just before harvest. I was cutting corn for Lawrence and went to dinner, and he took dinner with us, and when dinner was over, they went into another room, and I didn't see him again till he came to Palmyra to preach. Yours with respect, from Lorenzo Saunders. End quote. Okay, so that was the third statement. Let's move on to the fourth one real quick. Quote, made by Saunders to the Justice of Peace. Statement of Lorenzo Saunders, SS, Hillsdale, State of Michigan. So this was notarized by a Justice of the Peace. Lorenzo Saunders, being duly sworn, deposes and says that I reside in Reading, Hillsdale County, State of Michigan, and I was born in the town of Palmyra, Wayne County, State of New York, on June 7th, 1811, and am now 76 years of age. That I lived in said town of Palmyra until I was 43 of age. That I lived within 1 mile of Joseph Smith. At the time said Joseph Smith claimed that he found the tablets on which the Book of Mormon was revealed. That in March of 1827, on or about the 15th of said month, I went to the home of Joseph Smith for the purpose of getting some maple sugar to eat. That when I arrived at the house of said Joseph Smith, I was met at the door by Harrison Smith, Joe's brother. That at a distance of 10 or 12 rods from the house, there were 5 men that were engaged in talking, 4 of whom I knew. The 5th one was better dressed than the rest of those whom I was acquainted with. I inquired of Harrison Smith who the stranger was. He informed me his name was Sidney Rigdon, with whom I afterwards became acquainted with and found to be Sidney Rigdon. This was in March, A.D. 1827, the second spring after the death of my father. I was frequently at the house of Joseph Smith from 1827 to 1830. That in the summer of 1830, I heard Sidney Rigdon preach a sermon on Mormonism. This was after the Book of Mormon had been published, which took about 3 years from the time Joseph Smith claimed to have had his revelation. Lorenzo Saunders subscribed and sworn before me this day, 21st day of July, 1887. Linus S. Parmelee, Justice of the Peace of Reading, Michigan. End quote. Now, sorry if reading those statements right in a row was a little redundant, but like I said, Mormon apologists love this quote as being used for evidence of the Spalding-Rigdon theory, just because of the nature of the quotes. Now, I'm going to read a series of a few questions that can be raised about the differing statements to try and refute their credibility. I'll try to justify the evidence against the critique, and I'll let you guys decide if the pre-1830 Smith-Rigdon connection holds up on these grounds. This is taken from scn.org, a Mormon apologist website, and I'll leave a link for this in the show notes as well. Quote, Contrary to what is claimed in the Enigma, that's a book called The Spalding Enigma, at least 3 of the alleged sightings of Rigdon by Saunders occurred on dates where, according to the Rigdon and Smith chronologies, these men were either noted to have been elsewhere or, given their known location close to the dates in question, they could not both have physically been where Saunders claimed them to be, i.e., allegedly at Palmyra on March 15th of 1827. The fall of the same year, just before Joseph Smith went to Pennsylvania in December, as well as the 18 months Rigdon was supposedly at the Smiths prior to the Book of Mormon being published from the fall of 1828 to the spring of 1830. And there is some question whether the alleged sighting in the summer of 1828 fits a gap in the Rigdon-Smith timelines. Corn is typically cut towards the end of August and 1st of September. Yet the Enigma authors went on to knowingly and falsely claim that, now quoting from the Spalding Enigma, quote, "For in every instance without exception, where a witness or witnesses have claimed that Rigdon and Smith were together, a gap in Rigdon's chronology occurs which allows sufficient time for him to have visited New York," end quote. And they have said, quote, "Every liar slips up somewhere," end quote. That's in the Spalding Enigma, page 490. And it appears that both Saunders and the Enigma authors have slipped up here. Refutation number 1. Several of Saunders' statements directly contradict each other. For example, in his second statement, following the comments about the alleged encounter in the fall of 1827, he states, quote, "I never saw him, Rigdon, any more until he came to Palmyra to preach the Bible," end quote, which would have been in December of 1830. However, he must have forgotten that he had claimed 4 years earlier, quote, "Rigdon was hanging around Smith's for 18 months prior to the publishing of the Mormon Bible," end quote, making it the fall of 1829 to the spring of 1830, and he must have forgotten 5 months later when he gave his third statement, quote, "In the summer of 1827, I saw him at Samuel Lawrence's," end quote, though he did mention again that, quote, "he didn't see him, Rigdon, until he came to Palmyra to preach," end quote, which was December of 1830. This, then, was contradicted by his fourth statement made about a year and a half later, quote, "that in the summer of 1830, I heard Sidney Rigdon preach a sermon on Mormonism," end quote. So this refutation just seems to raise questions about the contradictions in the timeline, and it challenges the exact terminology that is used. So let me try and deconstruct it a little bit. As far as Saunders' second statement contradicting his first statement on the basis that the first quote said Rigdon was, quote, "hanging around Smith for 18 months prior to publishing the Mormon Bible," end quote, being in contradiction to his later statements saying he only saw Rigdon twice in the year and a half preceding the Book of Mormon being published. This is utterly absurd. The first statement that we read was a person quoting a conversation they had with Saunders about Rigdon. It wasn't Saunders himself speaking like it was in the second statement. Is it really that weird that we find Gilbert summarizing the occurrences from their conversation into hanging around 18 months before the book, and we tend to get a little bit more detail when we hear it from the person that made the statement themselves in a newspaper interview? Is it really surprising that there are contradictions there? I would argue that J.H. Gilbert merely paraphrased what Saunders said and then relayed this watered-down version of what we're reading today. This doesn't seem to be any kind of contradiction. In fact, it's what we would expect from two different people being quoted about a similar instance. Now, onto the claims that Saunders detailing seeing Rigdon at Samuel Lawrence's house in 1828 is another piece of damning evidence because it wasn't listed in his second statement. Well, my answer to that is, I don't know. I mean, according to the model that we're constructing here, Samuel Lawrence, Sidney Rigdon, and Joseph Smith all knew each other in the late 1820s before the book was published, all right? So is it really all that hard to imagine Rigdon visiting Lawrence's house while mingling in Palmyra with Joe and friends? No. The meeting at Lawrence's house is not corroborated in Saunders' first interview, so he might have made it up. Or maybe He just forgot to include it in the first one. Like I said, I don't know. What I do know is that Saunders is recalling this 58 years after the incident, and it's easy to factor into the historical analysis that his memory may have been slightly fuzzy. The remarkable thing is how well Saunders' accounts match up to each other when they're given on separate occasions years apart from each other. Now, as for the fourth claim that there is a problem with the testimonies due to the third statement saying that Saunders saw Rigdon preaching in the late 1830, and then the fourth statement says he was preaching in the summer of 1830, I mean, come on now. This is such a small distinction to make a fuss over if it is being recounted 60 years after the incident. Some of the small details might be slightly changed, like Saunders seeing Rigdon preaching in the summer of 1830 instead of in the fall of 1830, but the overarching facts throughout all four statements is what we are primarily concerned with, and all of the small details to a much lesser extent. I think that Saunders' claims are still standing based off. This is just one small detail that was changed. Second point of refutation, quote, "Beyond coincidence, the statement Saunders made that was immediately recorded by Gilbert and then sent in a letter to Cobb, and which preceded Saunders' reading of the Ingersoll and Lawrence statements, makes no mention of the circumstance in which either Ingersoll and Lawrence were allegedly involved," contained in the latter statements, but only mentions Rigdon, quote, "hanging around Smith's for 18 months prior to the publishing of the Mormon Bible," end quote, i.e. from the fall of 1828 to the spring of 1830, an event that was not even mentioned but contradicted. Clearly, Saunders got some of his memory of the events from his second through fourth statements from either Ingersoll or Lawrence. No, not at all. I just now refuted this to a plausible extent by saying that the first statement that we read wasn't from Saunders himself. It was merely a paraphrased conversation that Saunders had with his friend J.H. Gilbert. The fact that Gilbert listed the events so vaguely and didn't give any kind of specifics of the meetings is to be completely expected when we compare it to an interview of the actual first-hand account person. There doesn't seem to be much ground for calling this a discrepancy of any kind. This falls right in line with logic. Third point of refutation, quote, "Saunders' statement was made after 52 years of silence on the matter. The alleged events took place in 1827, and the first of four statements from the Saunders was made in 1879. A purported friend of Saunders and Cobb, a reporter from Salt Lake City, were attempting to make the pre-1830 Rigdon-Smith connection so as to undergird a major weakness in the Spalding theory." End quote. Okay, this is basically claiming that the statements these guys made, Lorenzo Saunders, Chase, Cobb, Gilbert, can't be true because they were so long after the fact and they had a bias of trying to investigate the thing that they were investigating. Well, there's no such thing as an unbiased opinion or an unbiased investigation of the facts. That's why they're called opinions, because they are personal and aren't necessarily subject to the facts. The simple fact is, we have the church history that claims Sidney and Joe never met until December 1830, and we have conflicting claims of multiple people that state otherwise in a way that is detrimental to the church's own reported history. Both sides are extremely biased and are trying to serve their own agenda. We just have to decide which situation fits the facts best. That's what we're concerned with. Fourth refutation, quote, "How is it that, according to Saunders' second statement, he allegedly inquired after the stranger's name in March of 1827, and then he needed to inquire after the same stranger's name in the fall of the same year? If Saunders allegedly forgot the name of the stranger after just 6 months or so, how is it he is able to then remember the name after 52 years? End quote. This is easily explainable. It's the same reason that James Gordon Bennett last episode called Sidney Rigdon Henry Rigdon. People are inherently bad with each other's names. Have you ever met a person in a small conversation or just in passing, gotten their name, and then you see them at the grocery store a few months later or something? Have you ever not remembered their name? Or have you ever actually remembered their name? I would be surprised. Or their occupation, or what kind of underwear they had on at the time. I doubt that you remember every single person that you met just in passing, didn't even have a conversation with, just saw on the street. I mean, personally, I took a new route at work, and I'm dealing with hundreds of new people that I had to meet and learn something about to relate to them later in conversation with. Now, I only remember a small number of the names I'm supposed to remember, and that's only because those people stood out to me somehow. I even saw one of my customers at Carl's Jr., and I couldn't remember his name for the life of me. I thought he was just a mechanic that I had spoken to briefly, but no, he was the owner of a huge shop that I service 5 stops down the road. I had had multiple conversations with this man every 2 weeks for the past 3 months, calling him by name, and I couldn't remember his name or what shop he was associated with, or even the fact that he was the owner of the shop. Now, picture yourself at the Smith's house in 1827, standing in Saunders' shoes. You walk up to the front door, and it's answered by Hiram Smith. Oh, that's another thing to illustrate how bad people are with names. Saunders called Hiram Smith fucking Harrison Smith the whole goddamn time. So you're standing there in front of Hiram Smith, who answered the door, and you ask him for some sugar. So he invites you in politely, and you see out of the corner of your eye 5, possibly 6 men standing under a tree visiting, much like people used to do back before Twitter was a thing. You say, Hiram, I know everybody over there talking, except for the well-dressed gentleman. Who is he? Hiram replies, a treasure seeker and a preacher from Ohio named Sidney Rigdon. You shrug your shoulders and say, never heard of him. Thanks for the sugar. And you head down the road. Nothing in that scene was remarkable for anybody involved. It's easy to forget such a meaningless situation and a person's name like that you only hear in a short conversation. He didn't even talk to the guys that were standing under the tree. Now, a few months after that, Saunders and his buddy Ingersoll are walking down the road in New York and pass none other than Sidney motherfucking Rigdon. Ingersoll, being better acquainted with Rigdon than Saunders was, bullshits with him for like 15 minutes and then they part ways. While walking away from the conversation, Saunders probably looked over to Ingersoll and said, I know that guy. I know I've seen that man before. I just can't remember where. What was his name again? And there we have a completely plausible, natural explanation for Saunders forgetting Rigdon's name the first time he saw him, and after 6 months of not seeing him, he had to ask for his name again. The reason he remembered the name so clearly 52 years after the incident is because it was Sidney motherfucking Rigdon, right-hand man of the Mormonite prophet Joseph Smith Jr. and co-founder of the Church of Christ cult. Before that, Rigdon was just a dude in a suit leaning against a tree bullshitting with some other dudes. Does Saunders forgetting a person's name really hurt the credibility of his statements? Because personally, I think that the statements are still standing up quite well when offered a completely plausible, natural explanation when they meet criticism. This article that I am quoting from asks a whole bunch more questions that I can't take the time to get into now because I'm a bit overdue on my time limit for this episode. But for now, we have a basic understanding and a story for Sidney Rigdon, and that is a big piece of the foundation to lay for us to start building onto. Next episode will be an in-depth analysis of the actual Solomon Spaulding theory and how Rigdon might have been involved. Just a closing note on the Spaulding theory and how it's viewed in most academic and historical worlds. Well, it's not. It's been thrown out by almost all reputable scholars on Mormon history. The reason why is sheer lack of evidence. Joe, Cowdung, and Rigdon obfuscated their early histories together and vehemently denied them so much that it's not easy to approach that wall of testimony in an effort to knock a hole in it, let alone try to knock the wall down. The reality is, this theory requires some suppositions, and we have to take some historical liberties to explain why some of the details don't quite line up. Also, the biggest problem with the theory is the lack of source material. Whereas the leading competing theory for the source text for the Book of Mormon is a best-selling book in 1823 written by Ethan Smith called A View of the Hebrews, whereas manuscript found, the source text that would link Joseph Smith and Solomon Spaulding through Sidney Rigdon, is missing in action. We can't truly verify what's in that book. For this reason, primarily, the Spaulding theory sits in the margins of Mormon history, waiting for some new evidence to bring it to the forefront as the leading theory. But we'll really dive into that next episode. That's pretty much it for the historical analysis of this episode. Before I wrap it up, I do have a new NAMO Adolescent Rebel to thank. Tor M. Thank you, Tor, for not only being awesome enough to contribute to the show, but also for having a super badass name that I get to say with epic inflection. Tor! Your kindness and generosity will forever be stitched into the velvety ventricles of the heart of the podcast. Thank you for your support. There was one other person that I just had to thank really quickly. Demonista. Anybody that keeps up with the Facebook page may have been noticing that there's been a lot of posts on there recently. Please don't think that I've been awesome enough to actually been, keeping up with my Facebook page and posting interesting things on there, aside from what it has been, which has just been, me posting that the new episode's out. I would like everybody to welcome the newest contributor to the Naked Mormonism Facebook page, Demonista. She's been doing a good job. She's been putting up a lot of interesting things to comment on the Facebook page and to spark some more conversation and really kind of get things rolling. So I just really wanted to thank her for that. And, I encourage everybody to go look at the Facebook page now because, before now it was, just kind of me posting new episodes and that was pretty much it. So yeah, it's definitely quite a bit more exciting now. So I encourage everybody to go check out the Facebook page. Last episode, I did say that there were whispers of something lurking in the shadows of Nemo Outer Darkness. Well, I'm afraid I don't know what it is I'm dealing with here. The demons are talking about what's out there, but they're so fear-stricken, it's hard to understand exactly what they could possibly mean by the unholy. Is it a force, a presence, an entity? None seem to know. Initially, there were rumors of a name to call it by. Many spoke of it with more confidence because they thought they knew what to call it, Preston, but they were all mistaken. I had to find out for myself. So I petitioned the assistance of all demons occupying outer darkness, and we think we have something solid to go on. We asked in all sincerity for the darkness around us to provide a sign, something, anything to tell us that it could hear us. Just as we were all divining all of our energy to the darkness in unholy inquisition, the ground underneath our feet violently shifted, knocking all of us flat. As we regained our composure and began looking around, 3 letters, each scratched into white light, formed in the black firmament above our heads. JMS. What could it mean? Well, I guess that's it for today's episode on A Hingepin Rigdon. I hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.